Hi everybody, my name is Taylor. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about GraphQL and modern TypeScript development, the kinds of problems you're going to run into as a developer, and the kinds of solutions that we have today via Graphweaver. A little bit about myself here. My name is Taylor, as I said. I work at Exegy. I'm a full stack engineer where I work with things like React, TypeScript, Postgres, SQL, GraphQL we'll be talking about today, those kinds of things. I've been working on a cryptocurrency trading platform and Graphweaver, which I'm going to tell you a lot about tonight. I'm also a musician. I sing and play guitar. If you want to form a 80s hair metal cover band with me, just come let me know. That would be awesome. I'm also a wildlife photographer. I just came back from Montana. This is an American bison. Fun fact, if you learn nothing else tonight, this is not a buffalo. What happened was, in the 1500s, a French guy came over and he saw this thing and he was like, that's a buffalo. I've seen that before. He's wrong. It's a totally different species. Buffalo live in Southeast Asia, and what you see here is an American bison. And much like the American bison, I too am an American. And I have to give a shout out to Sharky and to SydJS because I've actually got this job by coming to this meetup and talking to a guy named Kevin and talking to a guy named Gavin. And through those conversations leading to a couple of interviews and then eventually to this role and to this stage here. And without those guys, I could be picking cantaloupe in the Northern Territory for my visa. And instead I get to talk about TypeScript and GraphQL. Enough about Melon. Let's talk about GraphQL. A little bit of background on GraphQL. What is GraphQL? It stands for Graph Query Language. And it was developed by Facebook in 2012 and then open sourced to the community in 2015. They were trying to solve this problem with their mobile app where they had, if you can imagine your iPhone 3G, right? You had a news feed which was made of your friends, and those friends had posts, and those posts had comments, and those comments had likes, and those posts had likes. And they needed to get all of those things together on the mobile app in one front end. And they were trying to do this with a traditional REST architecture. And the way that REST works is that there's one endpoint for each entity. So you might have something like api.facebook.com/friends. And then you make a request to that to get your friends back. And then you have another endpoint for those posts. So you have api.com/facebook/blah, blah, blah, /posts. And then you get the posts back. And what you need to do there is you need to make a round trip request for each one of those entities and then conglomerate them together to build a mobile app experience. And that's clumsy and slow. And I'm going to steal a metaphor from Honeypot. Honeypot do great tech documentaries on YouTube. If you haven't heard of them, check out Honeypot. They did a tech documentary on GraphQL, and the guys who were describing GraphQL were like, REST is like a vending machine where you press a button and you have to wait for something to come out of the machine before you can press another button and get the next thing. And then they approach this problem with, well, what if I built a button that presses multiple buttons for you? So you press a button that gets your Facebook's friends, posts, and comments. But that still doesn't scale well. So this is the problem they were trying to solve. And the solution that they come up with is GraphQL. And the secret sauce to GraphQL is that you can make a request for exactly what you want and get it back in one response. And it does this with queries. So queries, you can ask for anything. You can ask for what you'd like. And then mutations are your basic CRUD operations on those entities. GraphQL is a type system where you describe an object and its fields. So a Facebook friend might have a name that's a string, and then its relationships to other objects. So a friend might have an array of posts that exist in your GraphQL schema. And that's all defined by your GraphQL schema definition language. So let's look at an example. Pretty simple one here is we're writing a query for to-do, and in GraphQL you can pass in a variable. So in this case, we're asking for the specific to-do variable with the ID 101, and we're getting back that ID, an isCompleted flag, and then a user, which is a different object that has a relationship to the to-do. So in this case, a to-do is assigned to a user, and you're getting all that back as a response on your right here. So with that little bit of background, let's talk about the kinds of things you're going to be, the kinds of problems you might run into as a developer building a modern app. The first one is that you've probably got multiple data sources. You've probably got a database that is something like orders, and then you have customer info in Salesforce or Microsoft CRM Dynamics. And then you maybe have another API for your invoices for something like Xero. And you have to put all these things together and connect them up in order to have a great web app experience. So one solution you might come to trying to do that is to copy all that data together. This is not a great solution. Copying data is generally something you want to avoid. So you might think that you got your database that you can control with your orders, and you say, well, I want to know who's doing the order, so give me the customer's name, and let's just copy that into a column in my database. This is pretty brittle, and you run into trouble with synchronizing these things. It's a security risk because now that the data that was held responsible by your CRM is now in your database, and just keeping these things together is really difficult to do and very brittle. So that's not a great solution. And another thing you might want to be able to do is to be able to query and fetch across these data sources. So you might want to say, I've got a database full of orders, and I want to get all of the orders for Steve Irwin. And then to do that, you have to make a request first to your CRM and then go back into your database. So that's the kind of problem. What's the solution? Well, you can sit one GraphQL API in front of all of your databases, all of your data sources, I'm sorry. So if you imagine here on the right, you have your 0, you have your CRM, and then you have your database. And in front of all those things, you can set a GraphQL API so that your front-end developers only interact with this one API. They don't have to be going and talking to all of these different APIs that are held by different vendors. And that's exactly what we do with Graphweaver. Graphweaver sits a GraphQL API in front of your different data sources and allows you to develop with one single endpoint for your developers to interact with. And that just makes things simpler and easier for your developers. Another problem you might run into when using GraphQL is keeping your types in sync. So out of the box, GraphQL is a typed system, but when you use GraphQL with a common GraphQL client like Apollo, you actually don't get those types out of the box. So let's jump into an example here. Let's say we want to get all the to-dos on the left. We're saying, give me all the to-dos in the system, give me their IDs, give me their isCompleted flag, and give me the user assigned to that thing. Now, when you make that request, you don't get any of those types back. So a solution you might come to is on the top right here. You might say, let's type the query response from that request. So here we've defined that interface as the to-dos query, where we're expecting an array of to-dos, and the ID is a string. The isCompleted flag is a Boolean, and then your user is a user. And in this example, we're defining the user type somewhere else in the front end. At this point, you're probably already duplicating your types because you've got to maintain a user type on the front end, and you've got a user type in your GraphQL API. And the trouble with this solution is that if you go and change your get to-dos query, say you want to ask for the description on those to-dos, you also have to maintain the type of that to-dos query. Otherwise, you're going to be running into TypeScript issues. So a solution to that problem would be to say, well, instead of creating a type for my query, let me just type the response of the query and say, OK, I know in my use query example, we're at the bottom right here. In my use query, I know that I'm going to get an array of to-dos, but I don't know what's going to be on them. So I'm going to partial that to-do. And the problem with that is now you don't know what you actually got back. You have to check for undefined in all of those places. You have to check for undefined on your user and on your ID and isCompleted. And so that's also only kind of a partial solution. So what's a better solution? GraphQL CodeGen. GraphQL CodeGen is a solution developed by the Guilds. This is an organization that maintains this code base. The way that this works is we've already got our types in our GraphQL schema. So why can't we just generate those types from that? And the answer is we can. GraphQL CodeGen looks at the request that you're making in your project. And when your server starts up, it uses the introspection query. So the introspection query is a query that all GraphQL APIs have that allows you to look at what's inside of your GraphQL schema and returns that back. So it uses this introspection query to generate a JSON data structure and then iterates over that JSON data structure via a templating engine that then generates your types for you on your front end. And that's exactly what we do with Graphweaver. We use GraphQL CodeGen so that on the front end, your types from your queries are always typed and they're always in sync. So if you're thinking, OK, well, I've already got my types in my GraphQL schema. I've kind of already described what the type is in my database schema. Can I pull that all the way through from the database to the front end? I wouldn't ask that question if I was going to say no. You've already got this database schema. Why do you need to repeat this? You don't. We have a wonderful CLI that allows you to introspect a database. So say you've got a Postgres database, and we have an array of a table of users. It will go through, look at that, and generate the entity and resolver files for you. And I'm going to show you this in just a minute. using Graphweaver. So Graphweaver speeds up your GraphQL development by securely connecting everything in one place, allows your developers to interact with one API, query across those things, and filter across those data sources. It keeps your types in sync with GraphQL code gen and allows you to even introspect a database to quickly spin up a new GraphQL API. That's what I'm going to do for you right now. So I'm going to grab the latest version of Graphweaver. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. This is going to ask us a couple of questions. What do you want to call our new project? I heard SydJS. Great. We support a number of backends, PostgreSQL, MySQL, SQLite, and a REST backend. And it's just asking me, are you sure you want to do this? Yes, I am. Now let's jump into that new SydJS folder. We are going to install some dependencies here. And this is the time that I've set aside for this. And it's going to go a little slower because I need to take another sip. Now, once we've initialized this new Graphweaver instance, we're actually not connected to a data source. So it's going to be empty, and then we'll connect it to a data source using that database introspection script. Here we go. So let's p-start. This is going to show you nothing because I haven't connected it to anything. So this is the admin UI panel. Let me just quickly show you what has been generated by running that script. By initializing a new Graphweaver instance. We've got a database connection file that basically describes nothing. And let's connect it to a database. Now, I've already set up a Postgres database with some dummy data in the form of a user table. Let's close this guy out. This is going to ask us a couple questions about our database. What is the database name? Is GW for Graphweaver. The default is good. That is good. That is the password. This is the user's name. And then it's scanned that database and it's generated these files. Let's jump back into the code. What has been created? We've got this entities folder, and the way that I think about this, the entities folder describes your data sources and your database, so your relationship to the database. We've got this new user that's been generated from our user table. And then the schema folder is how I think about this is what's exposed in your GraphQL API, and we've generated that user as well. And now if we jump back, we've got to restart the server. If we jump back into here, we've got our new data source, we've got our user table. We've represented that here in this admin UI that you get out of the box. Let's do something cool. Let's change the name of somebody's first name. Modo, everybody loves Modo. There we go. That's been updated and it's changed in the database. Now I'm going to show you one more cool thing. That's a pretty simple example. Let's jump out and let's go to an example with two data sources, because I think that's actually really the cool bit. Let's start this up. So it's the same Postgres database. I've just also got this to-do database that exists in a MySQL database. And if we restart this, our users are still here. They're exactly the same. Our MySQL database has a bunch of to-dos that have users assigned to them. And we're looking at two different data sources right now, right? Let's do a query of our to-dos by our other data source, the users. So in this case, we're going to ask for all of the to-dos that are assigned to John, whose name I just turned to Mo. So let's just make sure we do that, right? And we get back the to-dos that are assigned to John. And that is a use case of us looking at one database and reaching across into another database, filtering it, and getting that back in a response. Let me show you one more thing. I talked about the type generation. I want to show you that. We need to open up the folder that is the two databases folder. These are the types that are generated automatically by GraphQL code gen. Here's our to-do, which has our description, our ID, our isCompleted flag, and its relationship to the users. We also have all of the lists and the sorts and the filters that you might need that are generated automatically. Let's jump back to just a couple more slides. So what can you do with this thing? Well, we've built a large waste management app that had an extremely large Postgres database and a connection to a Microsoft CRM. We just launched an Agricultural Innovation Association website that connects things like Gatsby, Contentful, Eventbrite, a number of other things. You can build your own API with this. You can set this just in front of a REST API. If you really don't like REST and you're like, I don't want to work with that, you can just put this in front of a REST API. You can use this as a backend for front end or as a headless CMS. I'm going to run through some quick features and then I'll get to Q&A. Instant GraphQL API when you run Graphweaver. You just saw this. I did it in like 2 minutes. That's pretty fast. You can have multiple data sources. You can filter across those data sources. We've got row and column level security implemented. We've got a number of authorization methods implemented. Steve's just built some crazy stuff like magic links and one-time passwords. It's 100% open source, so you can take and use any of this that you like. You can deploy this as you need. Out of the box, you get this great admin UI that you can use to view and manipulate data. It's code first, so if we look back at those resolvers that were generated, you can go in and adjust those to do any kind of custom logic that you need on your back end. And you've also seen the code generator, which looks at a database and generates a new entity and resolver, generates your backend for you from the database. Cool. Thank you.